Encountering a Dragon-type Pokemon used to have about as much hype behind it as encountering a legendary. They had this identity of rare, near-mythical creatures that were stronger than most other Pokemon, and have always had the highest average base stat total among all types. So, what happened? In Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you can find Dragon types on most routes at most points in the game, and there's certainly no shortage of them. So where did all these Dragon-type Pokemon come from? To answer that question, we're going to have to take a look all the way back at the first Pokemon games and work our way to the present to uncover the steady decrease in rarity and why it's now become nearly just as standard as any other typing. To start off with, there were a whopping 3 Dragon types in Generation 1, all from the same line, and you know them, it's Dratini, Dragonair, and Dragonite. If you weren't specifically looking for these Pokemon, you'd be insanely lucky to just stumble across these dragons in the wild. You had to use a Super Rod, which is a late game item, in the Safari Zone, a late game location in which you only get a limited amount of time to be in. Oh yeah, and it's only a 15% chance to find a Dratini, and then a 1% chance for Dragonair. Altogether, the odds were stacked against you for finding these Pokemon in the wild. And if you didn't stumble upon them during a playthrough of the game, you wouldn't actually see these Pokemon in battle until facing the final Elite Four member, Lance, at the end of the game. And infamously, Charizard, who looks like a dragon and is referred to as one on numerous occasions, isn't a dragon type, because that would ruin the whole idea that the dragon type being rare is what made it so special. All of these factors make it clear that Pokemon was stingy with who and what would get the dragon typing, to protect its status as this near mythological legendary type, a cut above the rest of the types. Generation 2 wanted to continue that idea of rarity makes it cooler by only bringing with it one singular dragon-type Pokemon, Kingdra, the new evolution to Seadra. On top of that, yeah, there's really nothing else to say about the typing in Gen 2, which is wild for a region whose 8th gym is a dragon specialist and holds a location called the Dragon's Den. In Generation 3, they finally introduced a handful of new dragon-type Pokemon. Most importantly for our purposes though, it was the introduction of Altaria and Flygon that made a statement that dragon types could be a Pokemon that you could easily get on your team. With Swablu and Trapinch being easy to find Pokemon in the mid-game, as opposed to Bagon being another Pokemon that, while it's very powerful, is extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Despite all this, dragon types are still a little too cool to sit at the table with the rest of the Pokemon types, as Swablu and Trapinch aren't dragon types themselves, and yet to put in the time to train them to discover their potential of becoming dragons. But when you consider that Winona is the first non-dragon type specialist to have a dragon type on her team, you can clearly see that the Pokemon Company was trying to tone down their status as Pokemon akin to mythicals and legendaries, and wanted them to become a little bit more commonplace. After Hoenn laid it on thick with the dragon types, Sinnoh took it a step back, having more of a balance of what we saw in Gens 1 and 3. Similar to Gen 1, the only non-legendary dragon types introduced were the Gible line, a rare pseudo-legendary line that was actually the most accessible pseudo-legendary so far, being accessible around the mid-game. Similar to Gen 3 though, we get several new dragon-type legendaries, and not just any legendaries, the box art legends, for all 3 games of this generation. It was like they were trying to tell us, yeah, you can find a few of these dragons here and there, but the strongest legendaries, the literal gods of the universe, yeah, that's what real dragon-type Pokemon are. Generation 5 certainly continued with that idea, with now 4 total game titles all sporting dragon-type legendaries as the box art. Yup, 3 more deity dragon-type legends, and a couple extra fusion forms to boot. It seems like they really wanted to get across this idea of dragon types being extra special, but not without sprinkling in some other not-so-legendary dragon types here and there. This was the first time that all 3 stages of a dragon-type line stayed purely dragon, with Axew's line. Let's take a step back and evaluate. What is the dragon type at this point in time? It mostly consists of pseudo-legendaries and legendary Pokemon, most of which are not obtainable until the late or post-game, and then a scattering of weaker but still comparatively strong mid to late game Pokemon. Dragon types maintain their mythological status, especially through the creation and Dow trios, and still had that identity of being special and rare. But there were more opportunities to get these special Pokemon that didn't involve an overly convoluted way of finding them. The 3D era could be considered a renaissance for dragon types. Well, just for the accessibility. Definitely not competitively. The point of this kind of lies in the unsuspecting ones, the Pokemon that aren't meant to be these all-powerful beings or super beefed up pseudos. The fact that these Pokemon are unassuming is what makes the typing seem as ordinary as the rest of the types. It's what prevents them from continuing to be set apart from the rest of all other Pokemon. I also want to shout out Noibat, because while it was a late game mon in its home generation, it was accessible in the super early game in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and Verdant Cavern at levels 8 through 11. That's easily the earliest any Dragon-type Pokemon has ever been accessible so far. Generation 6 also brought with it Mega Evolutions. Megas gave a huge amount of attention to the Dragon typing, with it being the most common type to be added upon Mega Evolution. And above all that, Mega Evolution is widely regarded as just the straight up coolest gimmick they've done, fitting very well with the Dragon type's cool persona. And you know what's even cooler than Dragon type Pokemon? Hitting that subscribe button and liking the video, cause that's what cool people do. Generation 7, they definitely got a little more generous with who they would give this typing to. Alolan Exeggutor is arguably one of the least dragon-like dragon types, not just by this point in Pokemon history, but really of all time. It literally just lost its psychic typing by growing taller. I think by this point we can all agree anyone can be a dragon type. You don't have to be a pseudo, you don't have to be locked to the late or the post game, you don't have to be a legendary. Sometimes you can just be a really tall tree, or an alien from other dimensions and the far reaches of the galaxy. Generation 8 easily continues with the generosity of giving the dragon typing to unsuspecting subjects, with prominent dragon types this generation being an apple pie in a building. The fossil dragons are also really goofy, and stand out drastically against the usual coolness of Dragapult and Eternatus. And especially Eternatus, like they really seem to be trying to make up for all the others' goofiness with how literally edgy they made him. And then they made him a big hand. Nice going, Game Freak. Generation 9, Pokemon got a little heavy-handed with adding in dragon types. This generation has the highest total dragon types introduced of any generation. The box art legends are dragon, the pseudo is a dragon, there's gimmick Pokemon with several dragon type paradox forms, there's just ordinary single stage Pokemon that are dragon. Even the DLC evolutions of old Pokemon, the only 2 Pokemon introduced in the DLC, are both dragon. Not to mention, there's an abundance of previous pseudo-legendaries once locked to the late game areas, now common in mid-game areas in Scarlet and Violet. And we have another quote-unquote weird dragon type, one you wouldn't expect to be a dragon, Tatsugiri, the sushi Pokemon that's just a little tiny fish on rice, and is the same type as this dastardly behemoth. Now finally, what does this all mean? What it probably means is that we will get to see plenty of new dragon type Pokemon of different varieties in the future. We're probably always going to see a dragon type pseudo in like every generation from now on, because why would they stop now? And dragon type box art legends every like 2 or 3 generations. But what we'll also see is some quirky Pokemon that you'd never guess were dragon types at first sight. What I'm anticipating as well is that they're going to get even more lenient with what can be a dragon, and we could quite possibly see the first dragon type starter Pokemon, or maybe a very early game Route 1 dragon Pokemon. There are a ton of possibilities, especially with how gimmicky they're letting the type be. Me personally, I'd love for the next generation's Route 1 bug Pokemon to be the first bug and dragon Pokemon. Dragon type is also just straight up my favorite type, and it's been really awesome to see the love that the typing has been getting. I'm personally really glad that it's become a lot more common, and have really enjoyed all the new Pokemon that don't look like they should be a dragon type, but they are. I definitely think that today the identity of dragon Pokemon being special and rare still really maintains, despite them being definitely more common. But I think they'll always still have that reputation of that mythic type that's the strongest among all the typings. Which is why when the typing is given to a goofy Pokemon, it's just pure entertainment. Let me know what kind of dragon Pokemon you'd like to see in the future in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like, it helps out a ton for the algorithm. And thank you all so much for watching.